She discovered what the elite were hiding, a tactical blueprint so devastating that rankings could collapse overnight. Eala spent months perfecting a strategy, one that tournament directors pray never reaches the surface. The WTA establishment isn't just watching anymore. They're trembling, because when this revelation breaks free, the entire hierarchy shifts. What took years to construct could vanish in a single fortnight. Every champion starts somewhere. For Eala, that somewhere wasn't a glittering academy in Switzerland or a private coaching facility in Miami. It was solitude. It was obsession. It was nights spent dissecting footage while rivals slept, rewinding matches frame by frame, searching for patterns that statisticians dismissed as coincidence and analysts overlooked entirely. The tennis world had already written her story. Rising Filipino talent, promising potential, destined for mid-career peaks and respectful retirements. Solid, respectable, forgettable. But Alex refused that narrative. What began as idle curiosity transformed into something darker, more calculated. She wasn't content analyzing her own game anymore. She turned her lens outward, toward the titans, the women who held the rankings hostage, the players whose names appeared on trophy cases and championship moments, the top 10. She noticed something others didn't. Every dominant player has a heartbeat. Every seemingly impenetrable defense has eliteness. Every undefeated streak carries invisible fractures. But these cracks weren't visible in highlight reels or broadcast moments. They lived in the margins. In the third-set rallies nobody replayed, in the mid-tournament matches against unfamiliar opponents, in the statistical anomalies that journalists treated as background noise. Eala began cataloging these moments with the precision of a scientist documenting rare phenomena. She created spreadsheets. She mapped serving patterns, identified temporal rhythms in performance, tracked how fatigue infected decision-making in specific game states. She documented psychological triggers, what rattled certain players, which opponents activated their insecurity, which scenarios forced them into predictable panic patterns. Her coaching team thought she was losing perspective. "You're overthinking," they'd say. But Alex understood something fundamental. The difference between champions and challengers isn't raw talent alone. It's information. It's preparation beyond imagination. It's seeing the invisible. By her early 20s, she had assembled something unprecedented, a psychological and tactical blueprint of the top 10's collective vulnerabilities. She knew their habits better than they knew themselves. She understood their decision trees. She recognized the moments when their confidence transformed into arrogance, when arrogance became liability. The breakthrough moment arrived during a practice session in late 2023. She was facing her hitting partner, running through scenarios, when suddenly everything crystallized. The patterns she documented weren't random. They interconnected. They formed a unified strategy, one that exploited not just individual weaknesses, but systemic flaws in how elite players approach their game. Her hands trembled. She called her coach over. "What if we," she began, her voice barely audible, "what if we built an entire methodology around this? What if we didn't just compete against them? What if we forced them to play against their own nature?" That conversation changed everything. The strategy wasn't revolutionary in its individual components. That was its genius. It didn't rely on physical superiority, something she could never claim against seeded titans. It didn't require miraculous talent spikes or once-in-a-generation athleticism. Instead, it weaponized something terrifyingly simple: pattern disruption combined with psychological pressure. Here's what she understood that the establishment missed. Elite tennis players operate within psychological comfort zones. They've trained for years within specific parameters. Their opponents play predictably because the sport's conventional wisdom demands it. Serve, rally, move through established rhythms, attack the weakness, defend the strength. This system had created generational champions. It had also created systematic vulnerability. Eala's methodology worked differently. First, she identified each top 10 player's security shot, the instinctive stroke they retreat into under pressure. For one champion, it was defensive baseline tennis. For another, aggressive serve and volley patterns. For a third, consistent but passive rallying. Then, she built scenarios that made that security shot useless. She created match situations where their instinctive responses became liabilities, where comfort became death. Second, she weaponized serve patterns against expectation. She discovered that elite returners operated on assumption. They predicted serve direction based on statistical likelihood and pre-service mannerisms. Eala trained herself to randomize these signals while maintaining technical consistency. The serves themselves weren't impossible to return, but the unpredictability created microseconds of hesitation. In professional tennis, microseconds shift everything.
Third, and this was the psychological masterstroke, she built match momentum patterns designed to activate specific insecurities. A top 5 player who thrived against aggressive opponents? Eala would neutralize her offense early, force stalemates, then gradually shift pressure only when her opponent's frustration peaked. A champion who dominated through court control? Eala would surrender center court, force that player into unfamiliar territory, then exploit the discomfort. She didn't outplay them. She reprogrammed how they played against her. Her coaching team began testing these principles in practice. The results were staggering. Against recorded footage of top 10 matches, applying Eala's methodology, they won scenarios they mathematically shouldn't win. Not consistently, but often enough. Often enough that patterns emerged. Often enough that something had shifted fundamentally. The formula had 3 pillars: tactical disruption, breaking elite players' established patterns through unconventional positioning, serve return angles, and court movement that violated conventional tennis logic; psychological pressure, creating specific match situations designed to activate dormant insecurities and force suboptimal decision-making; adaptability architecture, the ability to read opponent adjustments in real time and counter them before they fully manifested. Most players had 1 or 2 of these elements. Nobody had synthesized all 3 into an integrated system. By early 2024, Eala felt ready. Not ready to defeat every top 10 player, ready to challenge them in ways they'd never experienced. Ready to expose vulnerabilities they didn't know existed. Ready to prove that she understood their game better than they understood it themselves. What she didn't anticipate was how terrified the establishment would become. What happened next would force the WTA to confront uncomfortable truths. Her debut implementation was calculated, not against the absolute elite. That would trigger immediate scrutiny. Instead, Eala targeted a seeded player hovering between world number 7 and world number 12, someone dangerous but not yet transcendent, someone whose loss wouldn't immediately register as a system failure. The match felt normal to casual observers. Eala won in 3 sets. Respectable victory, strong performance, standard progression for an ascending challenger. But inside professional tennis, people noticed. Coaches began reviewing the footage. The serve patterns, the returning angles, the inexplicable court positioning that shouldn't have generated such effectiveness. The way Eala had forced her opponent into 7 consecutive decision-making errors. Errors that felt psychologically motivated rather than physically prompted. Did anyone else see that? Text messages circulated through coaching networks. The way she got in her head? The serve rhythm was completely unconventional. She wasn't playing tennis. She was playing psychology. Then came the second match, this one against a top 5 player, a calculated risk. Eala lost, but the scoreline obscured what observers witnessed. She'd taken the first set. She'd constructed scenarios where the favorite felt uncomfortable. She'd activated something, some dormant doubt that affected the player's decision-making throughout the second set. After that match, the messages intensified. The WTA's analytical departments began quietly investigating. What was Eala doing differently? The data seemed impossible. Serve velocities weren't exceptional, shot consistency wasn't superior, yet the results suggested something fundamental had shifted. Some coaches started implementing defensive countermeasures against her specifically. Others began analyzing whether her methodology could be applied to their own players. Tournament directors noticed the intrigue. Media outlets picked up on the subtext. Sports journalists began asking oblique questions. What tactical adjustments have you made? Is there a psychological element to how you're approaching these matches? Eala deflected skillfully, attributing everything to maturation, experience, improved consistency. But the secret was spreading. By mid-2024, several high-profile losses against lesser-ranked opponents were being attributed to sudden uncertainty. Top 10 players who dominated for years suddenly looked vulnerable in unfamiliar situations. Casual fans didn't recognize the pattern. They saw upsets as natural progression. But insiders understood. Something was shifting. Someone or something was disrupting the established hierarchy. The whisper campaign began in private coaching circles. "Eala's figured out something," they'd murmur. "She understands our game better than we do." Some dismissed it as paranoia. Others recognized it as competitive intelligence finally catching up to athletic dominance. One particularly influential coach reached out to a sports psychologist. "I think we're watching something unprecedented. Not just a talented player improving, but a complete reimagining of how to approach elite competition." The psychological impact cascaded. When players faced Eala, they weren't just playing tennis anymore. They were facing the anxiety of unknown variables, the discomfort of being analyzed and understood at levels that felt invasive. They were competing against someone who seemed to know their patterns better than they did themselves. Fear became the invisible opponent on every court she competed. Power doesn't surrender easily. When the WTA hierarchy recognized what was happening, when they understood that Eala had constructed a methodology capable of destabilizing rankings and challenging supremacy, they didn't celebrate competitive evolution, they mobilized. The countermeasures were subtle. Scheduling adjustments that seemed coincidental, tournament draw placements that kept Eala away from top 5 opponents during crucial events, administrative efficiencies that limited her preparation time between matches. Nothing overtly corrupt, but everything strategically calculated to minimize her exposure and disruption. Behind closed doors, conversations intensified. "We need to protect the integrity of competition," administrators argued. Interpreted translation, "We need to protect our investment in existing champions." The WTA had built its brand around specific superstars. Eala threatened that ecosystem. Several top 10 players began coordinating their own responses. Coaches shared countermeasures. They developed protocols to neutralize her tactical innovations. Some experimented with serving patterns designed to disrupt her return rhythms. Others built match strategies specifically engineered to avoid the psychological pressure points she had identified. One former champion, desperate to reclaim relevance, hired a sports psychologist specifically trained to develop immunity against Eala's methodology. "If we can understand how she's manipulating perception," the reasoning went, "we can neutralize the manipulation." But here's what the establishment underestimated. Eala wasn't static. She adapted continuously. Every countermeasure became data. Every defensive adjustment became an opportunity to refine her approach. The establishment was trying to solve a puzzle that changed itself with each attempted solution. The psychological warfare intensified. Comments leaked to media outlets questioning whether Eala's success represented genuine competitive excellence or merely clever gamesmanship. Some suggested her methods bordered on unsportsmanlike. Others defended her as simply playing chess while others played checkers. Fan communities fractured. Some celebrated her as revolutionary, a player finally willing to challenge the establishment's self-perpetuating power structure. Others viewed her as dangerous, someone threatening the sanctity of the sport through psychological manipulation. Eala felt the pressure. She wasn't just competing, she was defending a methodology against coordinated institutional resistance. Every tournament became not just about winning matches, but about proving that her approach was legitimate, sustainable, revolutionary rather than exploitative. The tension peaked during a particular Grand Slam tournament. A number 3 player specifically coached to neutralize Eala's tactics faced her in the quarterfinals. The match lasted over 3 hours.
Eala won, but the victory felt hollow, physically exhausting in ways that regular competition never demanded. Afterward, she received a message from someone inside the WTA's administrative structure. They're considering rule adjustments, new regulations targeting unconventional serve patterns and unsustainable serve return angles. Your methodology may have forced changes to the game's fundamental rules. Eala realized something critical. She'd succeeded so thoroughly that the establishment was willing to alter the sport itself to contain her influence. But then, her strategy became undeniable, and the sport could never return to silence. You can't keep secrets in professional tennis. The circuit is too small, the stakes too enormous, the analyses too sophisticated. By late 2024, Ayala's methodology wasn't whispered, it was documented. Sports journalists had analyzed her matches frame by frame, data scientists had isolated her tactical patterns, coaches were openly discussing countermeasures at professional conferences. The moment of maximum exposure arrived at a prestigious tournament when a prominent commentator, frustrated by institutional resistance to acknowledging what was obviously happening, broke protocol. During a live broadcast, he articulated exactly what Eala had constructed, a unified strategic framework combining psychological analysis, tactical disruption, and adaptive gameplay specifically engineered to exploit elite tennis's systemic vulnerabilities. The commentary went viral. Within hours, thousands of viewers had watched the analysis. Within days, every serious tennis publication had dissected her methodology. Within a week, collegiate and professional coaches were studying her serve patterns, her return positioning, her court movement with the intensity usually reserved for analyzing legendary champions. The reaction was polarizing. Some hailed her as visionary, someone who'd understood that tennis was evolving beyond pure athleticism into strategic sophistication. She represented the future. She demonstrated that preparation, intelligence, and psychological acuity could compete against raw dominance. She was proof that the sport's hierarchy wasn't predetermined, but contested. Others viewed her with something approaching resentment. Establishment figures suggested she'd weaponized psychology in ways that violated tennis's spiritual essence. Critics argued that she'd transformed the sport from competition into psychological manipulation. Some even questioned whether players facing her should receive psychological counseling afterward. The WTA faced an unprecedented crisis. If they banned her methodology, they'd be explicitly acknowledging that the sport needed protection from intellectual superiority. If they allowed it to proliferate, the established hierarchy would crumble. Other ambitious players would adopt her framework. Rankings would become unstable. The sport's familiar narrative would collapse. Eala faced her own crisis. She understood that exposure changed everything. Her advantage had relied partially on surprise. Now that her methodology was public, opponents would prepare with specific knowledge. The element of unpredictability, so critical to her success, would diminish. In a quiet moment, speaking with her closest advisor, she articulated the fundamental question: do I continue refining the strategy and accept that I've shared it with the world, or do I simplify, adapt, and evolve beyond what everyone now understands? She chose evolution. Rather than defending her existing methodology, Eala began reconstructing it. New tactical layers, psychological frameworks that incorporated awareness of her opponent's countermeasures, serve patterns designed with the knowledge that opponents anticipated certain angles. She was building strategy on top of strategy, competing not just against players, but against analysis of her own competition. In this moment, something shifted fundamentally. She stopped being the challenger trying to disrupt the hierarchy. She became something more dangerous, a player who understood competitive tennis at such a comprehensive level that she could outthink anyone willing to compete against her intellectually, first. Physical execution, second.
The establishment recognized they couldn't contain her. They could only hope she chose restraint. They could only pray she didn't decide to weaponize her full capabilities against the entire structure simultaneously. Every revolutionary moment contains its own paradox. Eala had challenged the establishment so completely that the establishment had no choice but to acknowledge competitive reality was changing. But that acknowledgement came with a cost: attention, scrutiny, pressure unlike anything she'd previously experienced. Her ranking ascended rapidly. She'd proven herself against elite competition repeatedly. She'd demonstrated that her methodology worked across different court surfaces, playing conditions, and opponent styles. But with each victory came intensified defensive coordination. Every player she faced had studied her. Every coach had developed countermeasures. Every strategic advantage she'd constructed was being analyzed, dissected, and neutralized in real time. Yet something remarkable happened. Rather than weakening, her performance intensified. The psychological pressure that might have broken another player seemed to fuel her. She thrived in the attention. She excelled under scrutiny. She performed better when opponents expected specific patterns because she was already evolving beyond those expectations. By early 2025, the tennis world was forced to acknowledge something unprecedented. The establishment's traditional hierarchy was becoming destabilized, not through a single dominant player emerging, but through one player understanding competitive tennis so comprehensively that she could outthink anyone willing to compete against her intellectually, first. Physical execution, second. The establishment recognized they couldn't contain her. They could only hope she chose restraint. They could only pray she didn't decide to weaponize her full capabilities against the entire structure simultaneously. Every revolutionary moment contains its own paradox. Eala had challenged the establishment so completely that the establishment had no choice but to acknowledge competitive reality was changing. But that acknowledgement came with a cost: attention, scrutiny, pressure unlike anything she'd previously experienced. Her ranking ascended rapidly. She'd proven herself against elite competition repeatedly. She'd demonstrated that her methodology worked across different court surfaces, playing conditions, and opponent styles. But with each victory came intensified defensive coordination. Every player she faced had studied her. Every coach had developed countermeasures. Every strategic advantage she'd constructed was being analyzed, dissected, and neutralized in real time. Yet something remarkable happened. Rather than weakening, her performance intensified. The psychological pressure that might have broken another player seemed to fuel her. She thrived in the attention. She excelled under scrutiny. She performed better when opponents expected specific patterns because she was already evolving beyond those expectations. By early 2025, the tennis world was forced to acknowledge something unprecedented. The establishment's traditional hierarchy was becoming destabilized, not through a single dominant player emerging, but through one player understanding competitive tennis so comprehensively that she could outthink anyone willing to compete against her intellectually, first. Physical execution, second. The establishment recognized they couldn't contain her. They could only hope she chose restraint. They could only pray she didn't decide to weaponize her full capabilities against the entire structure simultaneously.